What?
Open the door.
I made them bring you.
You see, corruption is part of us. All of us. The very heart of us.
Hari Om Namaha Om Purpuva Svaha Tat Saviturvarenyam Bhagavadivasya Thimahi Theo Yo Naha Prachodayat. As the heady era of the 11 great pretenders reached its apogee, the atmosphere in so-called ISKCON became increasingly corrupt. Srila Prabhupada, to a limited degree, had created an epistocracy. His best men, as he twice called them in his letters, but free will, both individually and collectively, is what it is. When any kind of hierarchy, like the one that was created here, degrades, it invariably turns into a quasi-religious oligarchy. In this age of hate, hypocrisy, corruption, and quarrel, the chief remedial measure is that every man and woman must chant the holy name of the Lord, Hare Krishna. Nevertheless, remaining free from corruption, or if you're entangled in it, becoming free from it, is integral to the process. If you remain corrupt, and if you remain an enabler of so-called ISKCON in that corruption, there will be no impetus for you and those whom you influence to effect the revolution in the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. After all, we have come here to enjoy in a way that is not authorized by the Supreme Controller, who has created the whole field. The corrupt, conditioned souls exploit it as per their abilities and opportunities, and thus they suffer in an envious attitude as imitation enjoyers. The misleaders of so-called ISKCON take this to the extreme, of course, but the song remains the same for everybody. These 12 chief deviations are presented for your edification and realization in this 4-part series, and the last 3 will now be detailed. They give you a hint about where so-called ISKCON is at, why it has reached that level, and where it could wind up if it is allowed to expand. Its clerks operate their own cooperatives. If those are satellite centers, then they're small. If instead they are the equivalent of metropolitan hotels, then that arrangement, heavily dependent upon Hindu revenue, is much larger. Each one of these operations is a systemic joint mess, something that Hindu culture, which now has heavily infiltrated so-called ISKCON, has more or less perfected in India, as well as in the mundane motel chains that it controls in America. The real movement has long been spoiled by this pseudo-spiritual fraud of a joint mess, but the joint mess in so-called ISKCON continues on, in no small part because rank and file enablers keep it going. Last month, this series discussed how the short-term culmination of major deviations, which have been ongoing since the spring of 1972, had produced the unauthorized zonal acharya scheme. This was the first transformation, where all 11 of its chief beneficiaries were worshipped as Uttama Adhikaris, although they did not deserve to be worshipped as anything. This transformation lasted until the thing cratered in the mid-80s. Similarly, the 9th major deviation explained last month how the GBC was able to cover its tracks through a rationalization, and most ironically, even increase its power, once it became well known that Prabhupada never appointed anyone to the post of even regular guru, what to speak of as a full-blown Mahabhagavat. Now, the zonal scheme worked for a while, but things began to degenerate in the early 80s, when TKG was disciplined and his playground taken away from him, which also went down in the case of Hangsaduta during the same time frame. These two former zonals held a get-together at a swank A-frame in Topanga Canyon, California, and it was called the Pyramid House Talks. In the first week of December 1980, TKG laid the gauntlet down there on the remaining 9 zonals. He revealed, for the first time, that the appointment in 1977 was only that of the next set of Ritviks. He admitted that Prabhupada never intended it to be anything more than that, and that these 11 Ritviks had no right to claim that Prabhupada ever appointed them as successor acharyas. Now, just previous to this, the GBC of the Southern California zone, Rameshwar, had removed his opulent seat of worship from the temple room in Los Angeles and declared to his congregation that he did not deserve such Uttama worship. He then claimed that he was only a Madhyam Adhikari, but he was no such thing. 3 of his fellow zonals quickly arrived in order to force him to reverse course. However, not everybody could swallow the rationalizations which followed. Many of his congregation began to doubt the legitimacy of an arrangement where a Mahabhagavat, so-called, could abdicate his status and then, just days after, be reinstalled on the opulent throne. Not long after that incident, one of the most egregious of the 11, the psychotropic Sahajya, Jayatirtha, crossed the river and joined Swami B.R. Sridhar in Navadvip. By that time, the Navadvip Mahant had become virulently inimical to the ISKCON leaders and especially to their gurus. Yet, as was elucidated in describing the 7th major deviation last month, Swami B.R. Sridhar was most instrumental in empowering the zonal imposition in the spring of 1978. As such, many of the 2nd and 3rd echelon leading men in so-called ISKCON had gravitated to him, and they had broken away from the mothership, forming what was initially called the Mahamandala. This was the first schism, and although it cannot be exactly dated, it became an influential ontological entity in the early 80s. The GBC was on the verge of strongly confronting Jayatirtha for his egregious sexual and drug deviations, so he broke away. When Jayatirtha rejected so-called ISKCON, few in the movement could remain blind to the fact that the zonal acharya paradigm was breaking down badly. This led to even more politics, of course, and the remaining so-called gurus on the acharya board were thus forced to expand it. 3 more were added, but this step only briefly stemmed the tide of discontent when all kinds of new sexual fall-downs, both homosexual and heterosexual, became common knowledge to the rank and file. It was a time for a change. The competition, conflict, and continuing crises had exacerbated to such an extent by the mid-80s that a mood of rebellion was wafting throughout every temple, especially in America. Now, the great enjoyers had de facto excommunicated Hangsadutta from their brotherhood in May of 1983, and TKG, the great chameleon and shapeshifter that he was brought back into the fold. He predictably reversed course on what he said at the Pyramid House, so that breath of fresh air proved very ephemeral. Nevertheless, the arc of justice was bending against the remaining pretenders, and soon thereafter came even more revelations of all kinds of sexual illicit connections on their parts. The great enjoyers were on the verge of losing the temple presidents, who had formed by that time an entity known as NATPA, the acronym NATPA meaning North American Temple Presidents Association. These presidents were not enjoying like the gurus. Instead, they were burdened by all kinds of improperly initiated new people in their temples, because they had to indoctrinate those new people, and the indoctrination falling to them, that combined with being besieged by the congregation for all these fall downs being revealed and all the other nasty discoveries by the new gurus, the presidents couldn't take it anymore. So they now were demanding reform. And then Sulochan was assassinated in May of 1986. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it set the stage for the second transformation. After describing it, we shall make the connection between so-called ISKCON and the Rittvik movement, which initially surfaced as a splinter group in the late 80s. It is a major deviation, but is it in the category of an ISKCON deviation? This question will be examined. Finally, we shall conclude with the third transformation, today's Hinduization of so-called ISKCON, the commencement of which was somewhat recent. If any of you have just visited any major ISKCON center, you have certainly experienced it. Just as a dictator needs the army to stand by him in order to remain in power, to continue their scam, the high-profile ISKCON gurus of the early 80s required loyalty from the temple presidents. However, the movement's cauldron began to boil once it became common knowledge that Prabhupada never appointed any gurus, although just such an appointment was stated as indisputable fact for a number of years. Chastisements of TKG, Jayatirtha, and Hangsadutta for outrageous behavior, combined with the nasty schism between so-called ISKCON and the Navadvip Mahant, who was representing Gaudiya Mutt, created a considerable increase in the institutional tension. In the early 80s, a few more leading men were voted in as gurus by vote, and no one in that club was much bothered by any malcontent on the outside the walls of their cult. However, if any such discontent effectively reached the temple presidents, that would prove most problematic. And by 1984, it did. In Tuaco, New Jersey, at what was supposed to be nothing more than a routine meeting of the American and Canadian temple presidents in America, in September of that year, something unanticipated transpired. With the exception of only one of them, the temple president at Moundsville, all the other presidents almost spontaneously voiced their consternation with and disapproval of how the zonal acharya system was playing out. They had become opposed to its opulent worship program and its gurus taking over. In the words of one of them, something was drastically wrong, and they called for another meeting to dig into the problem more deeply and come up with comprehensive solutions. This became known as the Guru Reform Movement. By 1984, the temples were mostly populated by disciples of those bogus gurus. They remained loyal to their initiating spiritual masters, and they had little, if any, regard for the temple president. They more or less ignored the temple presidents and were even a bit contemptuous of them. The GBC of the zone, as could only be expected, also did little or nothing to assist any temple president in his zone, but instead, he generally threw his support to the guru who was initiating there. In November of 1984, the leader of the Guru Reform Movement, the temple president of Philadelphia, created a position paper entitled, quote, "The next step in the expansion of ISKCON, ending the fratricidal war," unquote. It struck an institutional nerve, big time. If there had been the internet, it would have certainly gone viral. It would have certainly had many disciples directly initiated by Prabhupada flooding the author with encouragement, which is what they did. The mind-boggling abuse of power by the zonal acharyas was now being confronted by the presidents, and this in short years resulted in the second transformation. However, in 1984 and even 1985, the Guru faction still was very strong, and they had remaining cards that they could play in order to stay in power and keep their opulence. In early 1985, through the aegis of the GBC, they added 4 more to their club. The temple presidents were complaining, but they were not yet united. That would change in August 1985 at an emergency meeting of the GBC. Most ironically, the site chosen for that 2-day conclave was Kirtanananda's Moundsville complex. He was adamantly opposed to anything resembling a guru under Vidhi Bhakti regulation, which the temple presidents were now demanding of the movement's initiating spiritual masters. Ravindra Swarup was now the man, and he distributed yet another bombshell entitled, quote, "Under my order, Reflections of the Guru in ISKCON," unquote. Your host speaker had contacted him earlier in 1985, and at least partially as a result, he now became aware of the importance of Prabhupada's term, regular guru, which His Divine Grace introduced in that important May 1977 room conversation at the Krishna Balaram Temple. Ravindra's new position paper became the ascendant thesis of the Guru Reform Movement. and the GBC gradually became amenable to its proposals. 2 years later, those proposals would become integral to the dismantling of the zonal acharya scheme, replacing it with the second transformation. However, please note that that transformation, that change, was a superficial reform. It was not a rejuvenation. It did not actually solve any of the root issues. It was considered and advertised as a revolution, but it was nothing of the sort. It had no real and lasting value, and it could not actually purify the underlying corruption because, in essence, it was itself nothing but a corrupt compromise.
I have a question.
Dr. Ernest.
Should we not consider that transformation a good thing and a step in the right direction? Didn't the overall mood and dealings between devotees improve after the temple presidents prevailed over the zonal acharyas, with the GBC finally switching sides and backing the proposals of the Guru reform movement?
It was not a step forward, it was not a step upward, it was a step sideways. Because the compromise that resulted from it allowed all the previous gurus to remain in their positions as so-called spiritual masters, despite the removal of their vyasasans, so-called, from the temple rooms, and the mitigation of the opulent worship of those great bluffers. Palena parchiyate, judged by the results. All of the gurus previous to the second transformation were part of a chain of succession that had no spiritual or devotional authority underlying it. It was a chain, a movement, a house built on sand. After the second transformation, many of them, the remaining gurus, were still in good standing. They were simply allowed to switch their masks. Allegedly, they were now regular gurus and had been the whole time, but they made an innocent mistake. Their disciples, very much desiring to do so, kept their statuses as being so-called genuinely initiated by those bluffers, despite the fact that any kind of real reform should have made each and every one of those newcomers fully aware that he or she had been deceived from the very beginning and was improperly initiated. Now that the atmosphere of the temple superficially improved once the second transformation locked in during 1987, is nothing but a tangential and inconsequential factor. It instead served to legitimize that which remained illegitimate. In that sense, it was even worse than the era of the zonals, because a program of no real solution was now advanced as completely solving the previous deviation. As Ravindra summed it up, quote, "We tried the single acharya system, and it failed, so we tried something better," unquote. Better superficially, but ultimately worse, because devotees within the walls of so-called ISKCON and even many outside malcontents were pacified by the transformation, your host speaker not included. The result of the superficial guru reform movement is what constitutes the 10th major deviation. Timing is everything, and the time was ripe for actual rejuvenation in the mid-80s, but most of the temple presidents compromised. Professor Blue Blood prevailed and was the biggest winner. The gurus survived by agreeing to remove their vyasasans and step down a notch, and most of the myths established after Prabhupada departed were thus perpetuated. The few temple presidents who insisted that the gurus had to release their improperly initiated disciples from the fraudulent initiation contracts, they all lost. And they lost big. The heady era of the zonal popes thus gave way to quasi-collegiate brotopia and an atmosphere of waffle-thin equality and peace in the movement. It lasted for about 2 years. Then another crisis surfaced from the ocean of Maya. The triumph of the second transformation was destined to be challenged, as festering discontentment with it soon churned up in the form of the Rittvik concoction, which is the 11th and penultimate deviation to be discussed in our series. In late 1989, 3 disgruntled Brahmins, all initiated by His Divine Grace, were engaged in simple living and high thinking at a rural American outpost. It was unaffiliated with so-called ISKCON, and they were doing quite nicely. They were publishing a monthly newsletter previous to the emergence of the internet, and it was entitled Vedic Village Review. The articles in it were sound, and the points they were raising in those articles were full of logic and Vaishnava ethics. Maya had to put a stop to this fledgling development, and she had a secret weapon in order to do just that. After all, malcontents on the outside could always be rather easily dismissed by so-called ISKCON, because the protagonists in ISKCON always could say that those on the outside didn't offer any initiations. They had no initiation paradigm. But then came a former personal servant of TKG from the state of Washington with a shocking message. Prabhupada never wanted any of his disciples to initiate newcomers because he, Prabhupada, was supposed to be the only Diksha Guru, even after he departed physical manifestation. As most of you know, beginning in 1970, all initiation rituals were performed by Rittviks on behalf of His Divine Grace. This was the system, even when Prabhupada was present for the rituals on his Vyasasan, which was the case during both of your host speakers' initiations. Previously, he himself had directly conducted the fire sacrifice while initiating new disciples. But in 1970, Ritviks performed the functions. If he was present for it, he would hand his new disciple his or her beads and sometimes speak to him or her. Nevertheless, the Rittvik system required the temple president or a visiting sannyasi or the GBC for that zone to conduct the somewhat complicated rituals. Nevertheless, everyone knew that each and every yajamana, thus blessed, was the initiated disciple of His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Tattvamasi. Now this fellow from the American Northwest named Gauri Das Pandit Das declared to the 3 aforementioned Brahmins at their Mississippi farm that Prabhupada wanted this system to continue even after he departed. All the so-called new gurus were only to be shiksha gurus, instructors, not initiators. Through a convoluted justification, he told his 3 godbrothers there that the appointment of the 11 Ritviks by Prabhupada in July of 1977, which reinstalled the Rittvik system, and that had been shut down for months due to Prabhupada's very weakened physical constitution, that this reinstallment of the Ritviks was meant to be continued, if necessary, into perpetuity. The slogan of this so-called dispensation was, "No change, although this devotee had sat on the alleged Rittvik revelation for over 11 years. He said that he inadvertently overheard Prabhupada say that this was to be the way to conduct all future initiations. There was and is no tape recording of this so-called order. There was and is no description or transcription of this alleged discussion. More importantly, there was and is no document specifically establishing and spelling out in detail everything that needs to be integrated to make this system work, a system that is unprecedented in Vaishnava tradition throughout all 4 lines in India. For all practical purposes, its shaky justification relied upon the hearsay from a relatively unknown devotee who says he overheard it incidentally while serving a very well-known sannyasi who was then Prabhupada's caretaker. That, of course, was TKG. But he denied that Prabhupada presented any such idea to him in 1977. What to speak of an order? Although it seems incredulous now, those 4 men at that time at the rural compound actually believed that the GBC would accept and adopt this new proposal. That belief was not without reason, because many of the newcomers over the years, those who had accepted initiations from either the zonals or its latter iterations, were very disgusted. They were disgusted with not only the institutional system pushed by the Second Transformation, which included reinitiation after a guru had been exposed and had been defrocked, but also they were disgusted with these new personalities who are now initiating so-called spiritual masters, but were in good standing with ISKCON. The first Rittvik proposal was that Rittviks were meant to be accorded special statuses now as preeminent Shiksha gurus, and that they had to be appointed by the governing body in order to conduct initiations of new devotees on behalf of so-called ISKCON. As word of this dispensation spread, it filtered into many temples much more powerfully than did the propaganda of Neomat, representing its recently deceased leader, Swami B.R. Sridhar. The Rittvik concoction was a major deviation, and its promulgation by the original 4 Brahmins, at least 2 of whom were very competent preachers and effective, constituted a major event in the ISKCON movement.
Vasu Gopal has a question.
Vasu Gopal.
It seems a bit unsound to accept the Rittvik concoction as a major deviation in the history of so-called ISKCON. Rittvik competes for devotees with ISKCON, and Ritviks are never allowed to preach at and are even sometimes banned from ISKCON centers. These camps are inimical to one another. So, by what logic do you propose that Rittvik is a major event that is directly connected to ISKCON?
Taken as a whole, the Rittvik movement is not only a splinter group from the mothership, but it is also a clone of so-called ISKCON. Unlike Neomat, the first splinter group of the early 80s, the latter Rittvik is Prabhupada-centered, and that makes all the difference in the world. As splinters, the Rittvik factions, divided into competing camps within itself, they're all in competition with so-called ISKCON. However, as clones, they are not. If Rittvik had not come into existence in the late 80s, so-called ISKCON would have had to have invented it. At the outer fringe, meaning the deviant outside layer of the esoteric core of spiritual life, both so-called Rittvik and so-called ISKCON are united in an occult way. Now, at the exoteric and esoteric circles, however, they are in competition. But Rittvik, nevertheless, is just what the doctor ordered for so-called ISKCON in the late 80s. The second transformation brought in a bit of mundane and superficial good, granted. That collegiate whitewash, however, also had counterproductive elements embedded in it. New disciples were not invigorated by it, as they had been during the balls-to-the-wall zonal acharya epoch. As such, an ever-increasing number of them were no longer willing to engage in severe austerities for a new and different set of quasi-collegiate gurus and leaders. Also, the North American Temple Presidents Association and the Guru Reform Movement lost steam because they no longer had the high-profile pretender Mahabhagavats to battle. Niyamut no longer served as ready competition, and it's not been challenging so-called ISKCON for years. That especially became the case after Swami Bihar Sridhar died in August of 1988. The Rittvik concoction served as an almost perfect foil for the leaders of the second transformation. Also, it helped that the mood of the centrifugal Rittviks was very similar to the mood of the new ISKCON movement. The mood of Niyamut was and is nothing but a downline version of the burnt remnants of Gaudiyamut. It is different. Rittvik, however, afforded so-called ISKCON a more suitable opponent and was also a clone. As such, it was a much better source of friction in order to regain energy and momentum for the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. Their fight against the Rittvik deviation gave their leaders and their party men and all of their fanatics a source of righteous indignation and the moral high ground. Although, of course, none of these people can ever claim any kind of high ground. What has been pointed out here should elucidate why the Rittvik deviation must be considered a major event in the expansion of the fabricated ISKCON Confederation. Because at root, Rittvik is very connected to so-called ISKCON. So don't be shocked when sometime in the future these two deviations find some kind of way to forge an institutional unity, but both save face. Now, we've already discussed 11 deviations so far, and some of them required further explanation when they were first listed, because understanding how and why they were corruption was not readily evident at first glance. Such is not the case with the 12th and final deviation presented in this series. This deviation is, of course, the Hinduization of so-called ISKCON, the third transformation. In his public lectures, morning walks, room conversations, and letters, Prabhupada described Hinduism as nothing more than a hodgepodge. Let us quote just two of those letters in this connection, and then proceed to describe how so-called ISKCON has been further dumbed down by anti-Vaishnav Hinduism. In a letter to his Bombay temple president in the summer of 1972, Prabhupada wrote, quote, "Avoid publishing my writings in hodgepodge journals. These so-called Hindus are generally impersonalists, and we do not want to have anything to do with them," unquote. Actually, they are either impersonalists or henotheists, although in the ultimate issue, these two badges culminate into the same thing. In a letter to an Indian devotee, disciple who later became an institutional guru in so-called ISKCON, after Prabhupada departed, His Divine Grace wrote, quote, "Other than the bona fide Vaishnava functions, we cannot divert our devotees' attention to such participation in so-called religious functions. This has spoiled the Hindu religion into a hodgepodge of pseudo-religion," unquote. Now, this quote should not be misinterpreted, as the Hindu religion was never bona fide from its inception. It is and always has been a third-order simulacrum of hardcore Shankara Mayavad. The Hindus have a scattered belief system that is united only in the fact of their panoply of cults, worshiping all kinds of deities, combined with their wrong belief that the supreme absolute truth is the impersonal Brahman, and that the goal of life is to merge into it and to become one with it. It is a philosophical hodgepodge, and the Krishna consciousness movement does not approve of it. Such worship of demigods and so-called incarnations of God should never be confused with Vaishnavism. Hinduism is an impediment to Prabhupada's branch of the Vaishnava cult, and he did not come here to the Western world to present it. He considered that India had lost its original culture, and he also considered in the same vein that the chief reason why it had lost its culture was Hinduism. He directly stated in a letter that none of the Hindu centers in the West were bona fide, and he came here to present something that was. He said that the Hindus were out of touch with spiritual science, and that it was very difficult to deal with them or to educate them due to all their ignorant sentiments. And most importantly, he was adamant that Lord Chaitanya's Krishna movement had no connection to the Hindu religion. Yet beginning in the 90s, in the mid-90s at Bhaktivedanta Manor, and then exploding into all the other major centers at the turn of the century, the Hinduization of so-called ISKCON has proceeded at an alarming rate. Hindu dance troupes and plays and weddings are now standard affairs in ISKCON temples. The Sunday feasts at its major centers are dominated by the Hindus. If a Hindu purchases a new vehicle and donates it to an ISKCON center, a nonsense car pooj is performed. Obviously, so-called ISKCON benefits in some way from this compromise, and it does not take much examination to come up with the most obvious reason. Considering the PIC has dwindled since the mid-80s, and the Hindus who come to ISKCON centers are usually well off financially and inclined to donate, this new revenue source has made many, if not most, ISKCON centers dependent upon the local Hindu community for meeting the temple's extravagant expenses.
Gokulananda has a question.
Gokulananda.
Are the dumbing down of ISKCON and its current dependency upon a bigger and better source of revenue, besides the dwindling PIC, the worst aspects of this unauthorized Hindu influence in ISKCON? If that's all there is, it would seem to me that you would not list it as one of the 12 major deviations since 1972. Is there something more, or potentially more, than revenue and dumbing down lurking in the strong connection now between ISKCON and the Hindu hodgepodge?
There is, but it is indirect and somewhat hidden. So-called ISKCON needs the rubric of the Hindu religion in order to be accepted as a major player by the Interfaith Initiative. The world order that will emerge after all hell breaks loose internationally will require a one-world religion. So-called ISKCON wants to make a strong claim in its formation, and that first requires it being seen as a representative of Hinduism, which, according to numbers, is very, very big. So-called ISKCON has been compromised since the late 70s, and it is willing to accept any other new compromise in order to achieve its goals. Its current compromise with the Hindu hodgepodge sets the stage for a much more dreadful compromise later on. In summation to our four-part series, the cause is in the effect. The initial deviations, at least in the form of their trace influences, are still 100% present in the current warping of the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. There is a chain of causality in all the 11 major deviations preceding this current Hinduization. This must be recognized if you want to actually understand what went down and why in Prabhupada's movement, even before he departed. In May of 1977, Prabhupada's final year with us, in the meeting with the Commish, His Divine Grace, had important questions asked of him about future initiations. But the whole thing was botched. This later led to a major deviation from what he ordered in that meeting. That deviation, of course, was the colossal hoax of the zonal acharya scam less than a year later, a corruption of horrific magnitude. In the month previous to his disappearance, another kind of corruption went down when Prabhupada's order that all of his disciples were to come to him was changed. Cannot you see that there is a river of continuous corruption flowing through all of these 12 events? After Prabhupada departed, there was the unauthorized 11 pretender Mahabhagavat corruption, aided and abetted by imbibing all kinds of nescience from Swami B.R. Sridhar. The GBC and the leading men of so-called ISKCON had become so contaminated that they ate up his bad advice, which went dead against what Prabhupada both wanted and ordered. The first transformation hit choppy waters when it was discovered that Prabhupada never ordered any of the 11 to be spiritual masters, although that was the propaganda throughout the initial implementation. Everybody believed it. In order to cover up that discovery, another big lie was hatched, rationalizing that the first transformation was still bona fide on the illusory basis that the GBC was the successor to His Divine Grace and could authorize it themselves. After these came the three major deviations which have been discussed here today. Consider all 12 as constituting a linked and continuous flow of causes leading to an effect which then became the next cause. In the process, our Vaishnava yoga culture has become a gold-plated pseudo-spiritual organization and has been converted institutionally into just another organized religion. Too many people are seeking easy answers. They want to merge into a group identity which has nothing to do with the search for absolute truth. So-called ISKCON provides them with this convenience in the guise of a new individuality, which is nothing but institutional conformity with a quasi-devotional flavor. All of this amounts to devotional depravity, operating under the paradigm of institutional corruption within the overall matrix of Kali Yuga. An abstract identification via improper initiation is being peddled by this cult, and it gives the foolish chela meaning which has not actually been earned. Cheap gurus and cheap disciples. All of it functions within a joint mess, shot through with corruption. That joint mess can never produce anything more than a surrogate experience for those who are implicated in it. It is not real spiritual life, because there are no easy answers. Part of the reason why so-called ISKCON has been able to hold on and even expand is because it offers many easy answers, all of which are not actual answers, but most of which are only rationalizations. You have to pay the price. You have to dig into the weeds. You have to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and that requires understanding cause and effect. By accepting the pabulum of the corrupt ISKCON leaders, with their one-liners and their cavalier dismissals about the events of the past, all of which are still active, at least as traces, even if that causality cannot be readily seen, you set yourself up as an enabler of the institutional delusion. Now, this may be pleasant for you at this time. However, it won't be when you are held accountable for your laziness in spiritual life and your empowerment of those who do not deserve to even represent, what to speak of lead, a genuine spiritual and devotional movement. In a letter to one of his governing body commissioners on October 8th, 1974, His Divine Grace gave the following warning, quote, "All these properties and opulences, whatever we have got, this will not go with me when I go away from this world. It will remain here. I am training some of my experienced disciples how to manage after my departure. So if instead of taking the training, if in my lifetime you people say, quote, 'I am Lord of all I survey,' unquote, that is dangerous conspiracy," unquote. The current acharyas of so-called ISKCON are all bogus, and their initiations are thus all improper. Their pretenses are becoming more and more obnoxious as time goes on, and His Divine Grace, foreseeing that His leading men could misuse their individual and collective free will, warned about them early on in the purport to Mantra 12 of his commentary on Sri Ishopanishad, quote, "By a false display of religious sentiments, they present a show of devotional service, while indulging in all sorts of immoral activities. In this way, they pass as spiritual masters and devotees of God. To mislead the people in general, they themselves become so-called acharyas, but they do not even follow the principles of the acharyas. These rogues are the most dangerous elements in human society. Sri Ishopanishad confirms that these pseudo-religionists are heading toward the most obnoxious place in the universe after the completion of their spiritual master business, which they conduct simply for sense gratification," unquote. Sadeva Samya